Um, I'm going to try and keep it brief. I feel a little daunted because the presentations to date have been so excellent. I've been really moved and informed and made to think. So I'm going to address the very simple question of what is a good death. And I'm going to stick with the theme which Jenny and Celia spoke about, namely a family experience, to give some sort of structure to my thoughts on this. So, on the 15th of August 1984, which was a Wednesday, I was the senior house officer on call at was then the Cork Regional Hospital, where I trained and where I now work again. And I was on call for the cardiac arrest team that day. At around 10 a.m. in the morning, I got a call put through by the switchboard. This was pre-mobile phones and all that, from my youngest brother, David. And he had phoned from home, which is about half a mile from the hospital. My dad had collapsed on the street outside the house, and David had phoned 999 for an ambulance. I drove as fast as I could from the hospital to our house, but as I pulled into our street, the ambulance was just leaving. I drove behind it to the hospital and followed my father to the emergency department. And I went through the double swing door of the resuscitation room where people who've collapsed like this are routinely taken. And I saw him lying on a trolley. He had been intubated, meaning that a tube was put down into his windpipe to help him breathe. And he was surrounded by the arrest team of about 4 doctors, along with several nurses from the emergency department. And they were carrying out the standard procedures of manual ventilation. In other words, they were putting air into his lungs with a plastic bag and carrying out cardiac massage. His face was a sort of deep blue purple. The cardiac monitor showed that his heart was not beating. This attempted resuscitation continued for what appeared an eternity. It was probably about 15 or 20 minutes. Finally, and eventually, the medical registrar, who would have been the nominal leader of this arrest team, looked to me for permission to call a halt. So, by any standard criteria, this was a bad death, dying in the resuscitation room of an emergency department, after the futile attentions of an arrest team, a bruised and bloody corpse. Arnaldo spoke about Philippe Arias earlier, the great French historian of death. And Arias wrote how people in pre-industrial Europe regarded this kind of sudden and foreseen death as particularly bad, the mors improvisa et repentina. The dying man had no opportunity to confess his sins, to receive the sacrament of anointing, to say goodbye to family. And I think we modern secular people would also regard this as a bad death. Sorry, I've done something there. But I'm not so sure. If you have a cardiac arrest outside of hospital, the likelihood of a successful outcome with resuscitation is about 5–8%, and God knows what it was in 1984. So my father was almost certainly dead by the time the ambulance screeched to a halt outside the house. What happened subsequently to him cannot have involved any pain or suffering on his part. He was 71 when he died. He had married late at 46. My mother was 20 years younger. He had his first heart attack in his mid-50s, an event which he tried to conceal. He had a further heart attack in his late 60s. He refused to attend hospital for either of these episodes, but did eventually consent to see an old-fashioned general physician who believed in a very hands-off, minimally interventional approach. For the final 2 years of his life, he had heart failure. He woke frequently at night with acute breathlessness, I could hear him. And this is called paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, in the technical term. When I finally got qualified, I tried to persuade him to see a heart specialist at my hospital, but he wouldn't hear of it. He hated fussing. He hated doctors. He was particularly appalled that 2 of his 3 children chose to be doctors. He hated hospitals. He hated illness. He self-medicated this acute breathlessness with whiskey punch, which gave him some relief at night. I really didn't know him very well. I mean, he was old enough to be my grandfather, really, and came from a class and a generation that did not approve of discussion of feelings and emotion. But I did know him well enough, however, to understand that he would have regarded this death as not entirely unsatisfactory. Although he never articulated this fear, he dreaded the prospect of prolonged illness. He dreaded hospitalization, and most of all, he dreaded loss of independence. Like Ivan Illich, who has been quoted a few times today, he believed in the right to die without a diagnosis. He would have been appalled by the prospect of deathbed farewells and regarded all displays of emotion as vulgar and unmanly. He would not have been keen on the inevitable visit of the priest for the last confession and the anointing with oil. Although he was an observant Catholic, like many country people, he feared priests, believing that they had powers that were not always entirely benign. He would have been amused that the cardiac arrest team in those days always included a priest. But by the time he got to the resus room and the chaplain, he was long gone. He died in the street where he lived, walking his dog. Had he been given a choice of place and circumstance of death, he might have said, "That'll do." His death was traumatic for the rest of us, but not for him. Nowadays, his body would have been mutilated even further by a post-mortem examination. But in those more relaxed days, the medical registrar was happy to sign the death cert and allow us to get on with the serious business of waking and burying him. So, what is a good death? Various criteria have been published on this, and some now even use the phrase successful dying as an alternative to the good death. A review published in an American journal, the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry, 2 years ago, listed 11 qualities of such a good death, including having control over the dying process, being pain-free, being able to engage with religion or spirituality, experiencing emotional well-being, having a sense of life completion or legacy, having a choice in treatment preferences, experiencing dignity in the dying process, having family present and saying goodbye, a good quality of life during the dying process, a good relationship with healthcare providers, and finally a miscellaneous other category which includes having your pets nearby. It sounds like an awful lot of work having this good death. Life is a messy and often chaotic experience, yet we seem to be on a mission to tidy it up neatly at the final hour. Death is unknown to all of us here, and adding an adjective like good doesn't make it any more knowable. Medicine struggles with not knowing stuff, so we try to control the beast by prescribing a more palatable version, one that creates an illusion of certainty. Death is the ultimate subjective experience, but the dead don't give us any feedback about the experience of dying. Rachel put up a slide of the Grim Reaper asking, "How was it for you?" By defining a good death as a list of tick-boxable criteria, I think we're losing sight of individuals. The concept of the good death objectifies those in the land of the dying by attaching medically manageable, quantifiable measures to a wholly subjective experience. Describing death as good or bad medicalizes it and sanitizes something we can never truly understand or accept. The enthusiasts for the good death discourage any raging against the dying of the light, and acceptance is the cornerstone of the good death. My good friend Columba Quigley was a hospice physician for many years and eventually gave it up in mid-career to become a publisher. And one of the things that she told me that she found difficult was that she felt that palliative care was sometimes trying to bludgeon people, patients and doctors alike, into acceptance. For the living and the healthy, death is just too big. We're trying to tame the unknowable. Since my book on The Way We Die Now was published about 2.5 years ago, I've lost count of the number of official reports, particularly in this country, on death and end-of-life care. And many of these documents are marked by a kind of earnestness, or what the hospice physician Peter Speck called chronic niceness. The number of agencies and charities jostling for ownership of death is growing steadily. Raj said earlier that we are creating a monster. There is a perception, I would say even a consensus, that death is a problem that medicine should somehow sort out. That a good death is something that doctors should be able to prescribe, like we might prescribe a course of antibiotics. Here's a good death. But death cannot be sanitized or workshopped. We're frail and vulnerable animals, yet we have come to believe that everything that happens to us, including death, is our fault, our doing, our responsibility. Death used to be tamed by religion and ritual, and we in the rich West no longer live in a world which is ruled by religion and ritual. We decided that these were delusions. Yet we have replaced them with a new delusion, namely that with enough regulation, compliance, official reports, guidelines, protocols, and workshops, we can once again tame death. There's been a lot of talk about the medicalization of death. I'm far more worried, actually, by the lawyerization of death. Human agency has replaced the power of nature, in Freud's words, majestic, cruel, and inexorable. Thanks for listening.